name, I have to say. My name's Alex Caples. I'm the Director of the Sydney Dialogue here at ASPI. I want to thank everybody for coming to tonight's event. Fantastic to see such a full house and so many others, I think, joining us online. So really looking forward to this evening. Before we begin, I wish to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people who are the traditional custodians of the land we are meeting on today. I wish to acknowledge and respect their continuing culture and the contribution they make to the life of this city and this region. I would also like to give special thanks to the High Commission of Canada for partnering with ASPI to host this event, which looks at women, peace and security agenda that is fit for purpose in the Pacific. As the world prepares to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the WPS agenda next year, many countries are taking stock of their WPS priorities and initiatives to ensure that they stand up to current challenges and that they can adapt to evolving needs and future threats. At its core, WPS emphasises that all people, including women and girls, in all their diversity, have the equal right to participate in national level decision making, including on peace and security. Both Australia and Canada have committed to strengthening and refining their own WPS agendas to ensure that the two nations are engaged and active partners for the Indo-Pacific on the full range of WPS issues. This enhanced partnership, I think, is particularly important in light of two current and rising challenges. First, a growing polarisation of the international community and a backlash against women's rights, which poses a threat to the advancement of, as well as demonstrates the need for the WPS agenda. Second, a common misperception that WPS only applies to conflict contexts that continues to contribute to the frequent underrepresentation of the Indo-Pacific in global WPS debates. This enhanced partnership is particularly, in light of these trends, Canada and Australia's work with regional partners in the Indo-Pacific is all the more important in supporting regional advancements on WPS, as well as finding new and innovative ways to increase women's participation in the peace and security realm. I'm joined tonight by four distinguished guests to help us step through the ways in which countries like Canada and Australia are evolving their WPS approaches and initiatives, and are thinking about how we work with and support the WPS needs of our Indo-Pacific partners. So tonight's format's going to be pretty simple. In a moment, I'm going to ask Lieutenant General Allen to deliver some brief opening remarks. Then we'll move into a panel discussion for around 30 minutes or so, after which we'll open the floor to around 15 minutes of Q&A. I think we're going to have roaming mics on the floor, but equally I'd encourage those who are online to start asking their questions now, and I'll make sure that I try and get to those as well. You won't be forgotten. We're then going to close proceedings, and we'd be delighted, obviously, if any of you can join us for some drinks and canapes in the foyer outside. So, Lieutenant General Francis Allen, I will ask you to step up in a moment, but essentially, Lieutenant General Francis Allen is Vice Chief of Defence Staff for the Canadian Armed Forces. Prior to her role as VCDS, she served as Canada's military representative to the NATO Military Committee in Brussels and has previously served as DG Cyberspace, DG Information Management Operations at Canada's National Defence Headquarters, and as Joint Force Cyber Component Commander. So, you know, pretty basic CV there. Really need to bring it. Thank you so much for joining us. I will introduce all of our other panellists before we begin, but of course, if I can just invite Lieutenant General Allen to deliver some opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me here, and good evening, everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here. I've come here with a little bit of a Canadian cold and frog in my throat, but I'll drink plenty of water, and we'll be able to get through this. And I'm so pleased to be on the stage here with such an illustrious group of representatives and esteemed panelists here, and I consider myself fortunate to be in the room as we engage tonight. Australia is a good friend to Canada, and we share our common values and ties that connect to our economy and our security and our people and our future. And as a Pacific nation itself, Canada's engagement in this region really is a priority for us, as of course this region is important globally with, you know, over a third of all of global economic activity happening in this region. And so it is just so important that the WPS agenda and thinking about that happens here as well. And so that's why we're deepening our engagement across the Indo-Pacific to ensure that the region remains free and stable and open for all. And that's what we need to be able to do. And today's conversation is so important around that. And I want to thank the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for bringing us all together to have this conversation. It's fabulous. And I'm keen to learn about Australia's unique perspective and experience in this region because while we come from a regionally different place, women, peace and security is a global issue that we have to address all wherever that we are from. The full, equal and meaningful participation of women in all facets of our society, including in military service, is the foundation of a more peaceful world. We know that women and girls are disproportionately impacted in conflict and in crisis. And we know that when women are involved in preventing and resolving conflict, the peace that results is more stable and more enduring. And we know that when there are more women in uniform, it improves the decision-making and the operational effectiveness on the battlefield. In Afghanistan, for example, Canadian women in uniform were instrumental in breaking down the barriers and building trust so that we could engage with and support Afghan women in their communities. And yet, more than 2 decades after the UN Security Council Resolution 1325 endorsed the global women peace and security movement, we are seeing a deliberate attack on gender equality and women's rights around the world. Anti-women and anti-feminist movements are driving, I would say, a worrisome clawback to the hard-fought gains that women have made, including in Canada. And social media is proving a dangerous forum for hate and violence against women, and that includes, as I said, women in uniform. Adversaries like Russia and China are pushing false narratives that women's rights are merely a Western notion being imposed on the world. And in this climate of threat and intimidation, nations like Canada and Australia have to push back vigorously. We must be as strategic as those who are working against us. And that's exactly, I think, what forums today are important to do, to have those conversations. We firmly believe that to achieve a safer and a more peaceful world, gender inclusion needs to be at the center of everything that we do. And that's why the WPS agenda is a key part of the Government of Canada's feminist foreign policy, from diplomacy and defense to aid and trade. In fact, just a few weeks ago, Canada released the 3rd installment of our National Action Plan on women, peace and security, and we've called it Foundations for Peace. And it builds on the work that we've already been doing towards the full and meaningful participation of women in global peace and security. And it's a blueprint for action in some key areas, from building and sustaining peace to sexual and gender-based violence to leadership. This is the 3rd plan, and we've actually quite deliberately in this one bridged the international and the domestic agenda together in its implementation of the WPS, because in our own country, there are issues related to inequality and women's insecurity that takes place. We've had the Commission on Missing and Indigenous Women and Children, and how we deal with that and how we move forward is important. These efforts are being led by Canada's exceptional ambassador for women, peace and security, Jacqueline O'Neill, with 9 federal departments and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as federal institutes that are part of that National Action Plan. And as the Vice Chief of Defence Staff, I know that Canada's military does have an important role to play as one of those federal partners. I'm proud to say that women have been a vital part of the Canadian Armed Forces for more than 100 years, and they serve in every type of role and every type of mission that we have with great skill and dedication. And right now in Canada, the women make up about 16.5% of the Canadian Armed Forces, which, while higher than the NATO average, tells us we still have more to do, because our goal is to reach a 25% target. And that's really quite a challenging space for us to go forward in. We still have a lot more work to do in reducing systemic barriers and creating a workplace environment that women can serve and lead in without harassment and without discrimination. And it's work that I'm deeply committed to, but I have to tell you, it's work that all of our leaders are committed to, regardless of their gender. That is absolutely what our leadership is focused on. Women, peace and security agenda is also important for Canada as part of its Indo-Pacific strategy. As part of the strategy, we're investing money to work on tailored training and capacity building on women, peace and security within the region, with initiatives for women in uniform in places like the Philippines and Malaysia and Vietnam and Indonesia and Singapore. And last July, for example, we supported an event in with the Malaysian Armed Forces to share our experiences with integrating women into the military. In February, our military training and cooperation program also delivered a course in the Philippines on integrating women and gender perspectives into armed forces, and they also funded an event on gender responsive leadership. So this is exactly the kind of engagement that we think it's important for Canada to be doing within the Indo-Pacific strategy, because it is a key for moving forward, and it has to be there to create the stability that we know that we need, not just in conflict, but in peace. We're training as we do this, but we're also listening, because we know that there's absolutely fabulous leadership going on everywhere on this, and it's happening, and we want to benefit from what we can hear from others in their experiences as we go forward. To paraphrase Ambassador O'Neill, the Women, Peace and Security agenda isn't an ideology, and it's not adversarial, and it's not a zero-sum game. It's the idea that women can influence the decisions that affect all of our lives, that affect everyone's lives, and that the outcomes that come out of that can be better. Gender and inclusion aren't problems to solve, but they're opportunities to embrace. And we want to be part of leading the way towards a full and equal and meaningful participation of women in building a better and safer world. We look forward to working with our partners in the Indo-Pacific region to that outcome. And I really am looking forward to hearing from all of you this afternoon, this evening. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thanks, General Allen, for framing this conversation, I think, in such a cogent way. I think I might, we genuinely are privileged to have such a powerhouse panel here this evening. I might introduce our other panellists and afford them the opportunity to perhaps open with a couple of framing remarks of their own, and then we can move into some questions. Lieutenant General Natasha Fox, Chief of Personnel for the Australian Defence Force. You will spot her by the uniform. Lieutenant General Fox has been employed across the ADF in Forces Command, Joint Logistics Command, Special Operations Command, Training Command Army, Defence People Group and Army Headquarters. I'm running out of breath here, there's so much to cover. She's deployed to Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and was the Chief of Staff for Joint Task Force 633 in the Middle East, where she was appointed a member of the Order of Australia for her service. As Head People Capability and Deputy Chief of Army. She's also received a Conspicuous Service Cross. Ambassador Stephanie Copus-Campbell, AM, Ambassador for Gender Equality, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Ambassador Copus-Campbell is the lead advocate for Australia's work on gender equality across all aspects of foreign policy. She has extensive experience across public, private, philanthropic and community sectors in Australia and the Indo-Pacific. She served as the head of Australia's bilateral aid programs with PNG, Fiji and Tuvalu, and has as well as been the head of Australia's Pacific regional programs. Additionally, she's had senior executive roles with Care Australia and the Oil Search Foundation. I think pertinent to this conversation this evening, Ambassador Copus-Campbell is also the founding director of the Family PNG board, providing services to survivors of family and sexual violence. Dr. Elise Stephenson, Deputy Director of Global Institute for Women's Leadership. Dr. Stephenson is an award-winning political scientist and international relations scholar, serving as the Deputy Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership, founded and chaired by our former Prime Minister, Julia Gillard. Her research focuses on gender and leadership in emerging fields of international relations, including space, AI, climate policy, as well as diplomacy, national security, intelligence, international representation, and of course, particularly pertinent for this evening, the Asia-Pacific region. Elise's book, The Face of the Nation, Gendered Institutions in International Affairs, on display here, just published by Oxford University Press, available in all good bookshops, and was... That's right, and I strongly encourage everyone here to make tracks to read that. Okay, so General Fox, if I can be casual and call you General Fox.
You can call me Natasha, Ali.
Any framing remarks or anything that you would like us to be thinking about as we proceed through this conversation this evening?
Thank you for that opportunity, and thank you, Frances. It's great to be on a panel with such incredible women, but certainly for me with another military colleague. And we were reflecting earlier about the military colleagues that we know, and there are three stars in Canada, and I know all three of them. So it makes it a very small world as well when you think of that. But today, I just wanted to give a couple of framing remarks around WPS, but also from a human security perspective as well. It is, for the Australians in the audience, it is your ADF that I am privileged and honoured to serve in, and your ADF has a representation rate of over 20% of women in its military. So if you think about that, 1 in 5 women in the Australian Defence Force are women, and it is your Australian Defence Force. And there are a number in here who are not in uniform tonight, and I can see them, and I'm incredibly proud of them.
You know who you are.
For being here, and thank them for their patience, their persistence, and for continuing to serve. Today is quite historic, and I'm elated. I firstly want to say thank you to General Campbell for your service with the announcements today. You have been incredibly encouraging and paved the way and championed women moving into senior leadership positions. That's not well known amongst General Campbell's achievements, but we wouldn't have 3-star women announced today, which is incredible. So as of July, 3 in 10 women in the senior leadership in the Australian Defence Force are women, which is very, very historic. And so that's part of your leadership and championing, and it's an incredible legacy. And I just want to say thank you, because I'm a beneficiary of that. So over 20% women. We are also targeting for a 25% by 2030 representation rate. Air Force have already achieved that and going for higher representation rate. This is not about just women in the military. This is about participation and capability, because we've been in circumstances where thinking differently solves wicked problems, not thinking the same. And so women and capability in leadership in varying different circumstances, conflict-related, security-related, think differently, bring different capability. And I know that our military is investing in that. When you start investing in equipment tailored for women, it is investing in capability, and that's what we're doing. It's not a one-size-fits-all for us. It's about capability. Now, a human rights approach, from my perspective, is actually a unifying approach. And if we don't do it to ourselves, how can we work amongst colleagues in the Indo-Pacific region and work human rights approaches with them? So your ADF is quite transparent about what it does and how it grows capability and has a human rights approach and a WPS approach in terms of women. So we look at our policies, we look at our growth and our education for leadership, we look at our equipment, we look at where it is safe and not necessarily safe, and make sure we take action against that for ourselves to then be part of a collaborative effect across the region to assist our partners, because we're stronger together when we do that. And when you do it together, you get better outcomes. So that's what we're doing. And I've got some very talented GPS advisors here in the audience too, who've made great inroads over a number of years that have done that. And I'm looking at you, Jen, and saying thank you for that too. I just want people to remember problem solving, capability, investment delivers outcomes. And that's what we're seeking in our region. So thank you, Gary.
Thank you. Ambassador Copus-Campbell, any framing remarks? I think incredible to see some of these ideas already converging.
No, thank you. And I'll also recognise General Campbell, who's here tonight holding my hand. Very good job, it's on the floor. And I'm also just looking across the room, and I do want to reflect on something. I want to note, I spent earlier about 8 years in the resource sector, and I'd go to conference after conference, and I was always filling in the forum. We need more women in the audience. We need more women in the panel. And, you know, kind of the remark I made all the time. Since I've been in this role as ambassador, I'm writing the opposite comments. We need more men talking about these issues. We need more men in the audience. I want to recognise today the number of men and women who see this as incredibly important. It is. This is not women's business. This is everyone's business. So I just recognise that tonight, and it's great to see. And it's not always the case when I'm giving talks and speeches and on panels. So thank you. Australia's approach is laid out in our National Action Plan, which I'm sure you've all read because you're all here, so I'm not going to go through it. But I do want to just note the 4 key outcomes and give you my perspective on those 4 key outcomes, both from someone who has been working in this space as ambassador, but also someone who's been working in conflict zones for most of her career, including in Papua New Guinea, where I've spent about 25 years. And the first outcome is supporting the meaningful participation of women and girls, and we heard that earlier, but I want to really hone on that word meaningful. Natasha and I were sharing a stage last year in New York at CSW, and we were sharing that stage with an Irish female Major General. And she came in and she said, listen, okay, I'm here. I guess I'm glad to be here, but kind of not really, because I constantly get asked to come to these forums on women, peace and security because I am one of the few, or maybe the only at that time, Major General in the Irish military. I really want to be invited to this stage because I am bloody good at my job. And I just want to reflect on that word meaningful, and that's true. And meaningful means we are able to tap in to this incredible skill set of 50% of our population. If we're only engaging with men and men's lived experience and ideas, that's what we're going to get. When we tap into 100%, we get 100% of that brain power. And we get that lived experience. I, again, was in Hela province in Papua New Guinea a number of years ago, and we'd gone from tribal fight to tribal fight to tribal fight. I was trying to help the provincial government think through some ways in which we engaged. And I finally said, let's just invite the women to the table here. Oh, okay. And before that, we'd seen the men came to the table, the men sat down, the men negotiated peace, they traded pigs, they traded money, sometimes they traded women. And they were fighting again 5 minutes later. When the women came to the table, guess what? They said 67% of our population is under the age of 18. They have no jobs. They have no education. They have no health care. They're bored. So can we just get something for them to do? They brought their lived experience as women in the community, as mothers, to that table, and guess what? It didn't solve the fighting, it's still happening, but the time in between that peace period lasted longer and longer and longer. So bringing women and girls to the table, bringing their lived experience to the table, bringing their ideas to the table in a meaningful way is absolutely important. And again, I sometimes think we forget to really reflect on that word meaningful, and sometimes we tick boxes. So that's the first thing. Secondly, in terms of our outcome is an obvious but important one, which is reducing sexual and gender-based violence. 1 out of 3 women around the world experience gender-based violence. 1 out of 3. In this country, in Canada, in Iceland, across the world. It's 1 out of 3 on average. And in our region, in the Pacific, we have the highest prevalence of violence against women in the world. Highest prevalence of violence against women, the lowest rate of women's political participation in the world, and we're at the forefront of climate change. And when you look at then violence against women in a conflict setting, it skyrockets. So again, if I go back to my PNG experience, in places like Hela where I worked, up to 100% of women in those conflict settings, 100% were experiencing some form of violence, and often sexual violence. Now, how can you participate when your safety is threatened in that way? It impedes participation. it also sparks conflict. You also see this violence as a predictor of conflict and a predictor of more violent conflict or of ethnic cleansing, etc. So we need to, in everything that we do, address this problem of violence against women. We need to do it in a way that we park the ambulance both at the top of the cliff to prevent it and the bottom of the cliff in which we are looking at comprehensive services to support survivors. And we need to do it in a way, I would argue, much as we look at gender in a mainstreaming approach, we equally need to be looking at sexual and gender-based violence as a cross-cutting issue that impedes all aspects of our safety and for our community. The third outcome is support for resilience, crisis response and security, ensuring holistically we have law and justice sector, for example, that is operating efficiently to meet the needs of women and girls and of society. And we need to do that through Australia's approach in our region of engaging in these sectors in a respectful way, in a way that takes account of the fact that we in Australia absolutely do not have it all right in this space, and to be humble about that, and to look at ways as we engage in our region how we can both learn and how we can contribute. And one of the tips I'll have for you in the security sector that's working in that space, when you do go in, we talk a lot about all the women that we have in our Defence Force or in the security setting, in the AFP, etc. We don't always show that when we go overseas and engage. And I was in a country in our region the other day that said, can you have some more women on your delegations, please? Because we hear why this is important, but we're not actually seeing it. So in terms of how we engage with our region, we need to walk the talk in everything that we do. And the last outcome that I'll just mention in terms of Australia's approach is looking at how we demonstrate leadership and accountability, both domestically and internationally. And I would like to draw your attention to Australia's new, if you haven't seen it already, please look at it, our new domestic strategy for gender equality. It is absolutely spectacular. It's spectacular because it works right across government. It's spectacular because it is informed by evidence. And it is spectacular because it is focused on true and meaningful results, including through legislation and policy reform. That will be replicated in our soon-to-be-released international gender equality strategy. Like Canada's, we won't be necessarily calling it up front a feminist foreign policy, but it is more feminist foreign policy than I think any foreign policy you will find. It will cut right across our foreign policy space in everything that we do, from how we engage in consular to trade to economic diplomacy to our multilateral engagements, to development cooperation, to our humanitarian responses. And I'm going to be really proud to support the rollout of that the rest of this year. So please do look out for that, and please do have a look at our domestic strategy, which again ensures that women across our region and in our country can meaningfully participate in all aspects of life, including in women, peace and security. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. I think, look, some really excellent, already some really good examples of what works. You know, and I want to come to this as we move through the discussion, some concepts of leadership and how we kind of make this happen from the top down, if you like, and also about what we know works at the grassroots level. So what works bottom up. So we're going to come to that in a moment. I think also some really fascinating things already around how we're not actually, we don't have this all right. We do need to say, actually, our domestic and our international policies need to be the same, because in effect, we can't walk into other people's countries and suggest that here's how you do it, because we're still learning ourselves. Last, but by absolute no means least, Dr. Stephenson, any framing remarks or anything that you really want to make sure that we take away from this evening's event?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't want to be the academic who brings their book to an event like this and really...
Absolutely. She's brought her book.
I am an academic. And so I'll just talk a little bit, because actually it's really just so tied into what we've been discussing here tonight so far. So my book's based on basically research across the last 40 years, longitudinal analysis of gender representation in our Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Defence, Australian Federal Police and the Department of Home Affairs, and the myriad agencies that fall under that. plus over 80 interviews with senior women leaders in our international affairs, including our former Prime Minister Julia Gillard and former first female Foreign Minister Julie Bishop, who also launched this book last week. And there's a few, maybe 3 things that I want to really highlight from that research. The first thing, which I think is great, is now we're in the case with DFAT, for instance, we've reached parity in women's representation. So I think 58% of the department and roughly 50% of all leadership positions are now occupied by women. Interestingly, Defence and the AFP have been the poorest at keeping up with women's representation comparatively to our other agencies. However, they're also globally leading. The interesting thing, when you dig into the statistics, though, was that for most of the period that I analysed, Defence and the AFP are actually leaders in women's representation, and I'll tell you why. So even though since 1985, women have been a majority of all graduates in DFAT, still until 2015 and the introduction of the Women in Leadership strategy, that distinct policy which initiated some targets, women were still a kind of critical minority in leadership positions. In fact, roughly there was a bit of a gap of between 20 to 30% between women's overall representation and their representation in leadership. In effect, before the policies were introduced, it would mean that DFAT would have to reach about almost 70 or 80% of women overall in the department for them to be equal in leadership. There was that much of a gap. Defence and the AFP, on the other hand, there was almost no gap between women's representation overall and their representation in leadership. And that more or less remains to this day, although I'm probably 2 years out of date in terms of my data. What I think that this means, and what a lot of my research suggested, was DFAT, policies work. We know that. So policies are really, really critical, and I think that this is something that should really be applauded. DFAT is leading globally in terms of women's representation. Secondly, actually the structures and almost, more militaristic command and control culture of Defence actually could work very well in our favour when it comes to gender equality. There's good evidence that that sort of style, if the mandate is there and there's strong enough political will, then we've got a good chance of achieving it in Defence. So we're probably held back by women's overall low representation in the institution rather than, struggling to get people to leadership. Another point was around transparency of challenges. So my research really found that, Defence has had a number of high-profile reviews, so has the AFP. We know the shape and the nature of the gendered challenges. We don't always know that in other spheres of international affairs. So this is why continuing to invest in the data, the evidence, and the research is really, really critical because it also helps us to achieve better equality. Some things related to this that I want to tie in. We've come, and Lowy Institute has done a lot of research into this. We're at a point in which funding for diplomacy continues to kind of plummet. We've had a few little boosts. However, DFAT's diplomatic footprint is considerably smaller than it was in the 1980s, and we've seen a bit of a shrinking of our overall diplomatic strength, I suppose. We still have a pretty strong, more security-based international affairs with very good funding. We need to think a little bit more about this. There are gendered ramifications from this. If diplomacy is now very well represented in terms of women overall and in leadership, and has really great policies around gender equality ingrained in the institution, and yet in more security-based institutions, we don't have that same level of representation. We still have gendered ramifications that come out from this. So I call this the diplomatic glass cliff. In essence, we see that women are constrained by the status of the institution they occupy. And I would say that with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, Defence does have a much more significant budget. There is an opportunity to have a much more significant role and budget when it comes to women, peace and security. Our strength in enacting women, peace and security, it's also commensurate with the status of that funding and the institution that goes behind it. So I think there's more that we can do here. Diplomacy is our friends. I do think that there's more work that could be done in elevating this space. A main point here then is that inequalities evolve. Even if we've got women in the room, we know that there's still challenges that mean that representation, having them at the decision-making table, it's not enough. So we need to be constantly on the lookout for, yes, is it meaningful engagement, but also what are the continued challenges, trolling, backlash, other ways of undermining progress, co-option. And the third thing I kind of want to mention is that it's not just about including women. If we want a more peaceful world, if we want a world that is based on a international rules-based order and that does have kind of peace and prosperity inbuilt to it, then we really have to have a think about, do we want peace? Ask ourselves that question. Do we want peace? Because as far as I can see, the defence industry is still alive and thriving. And with conflicts in Myanmar and across Israel and Palestine and many other parts of the world, we know that many countries rely heavily on their defence industries for economic development. It is worth asking ourselves, to what degree do we want a more peaceful world? And when we have a think about, I suppose, the relationship between gender and violence, and I'm really glad and grateful for Canada's leadership when it comes to focus on more domestic issues. There's been great research that has come out of the Middle East and the work of Professor Valerie Hudson, which links, for instance, the level of domestic violence in a society with a state's propensity to use violence against its interstate neighbours. So there is a direct link between violence in the home and violence at an international level. So whenever I'm in national security circles and people say, domestic violence, that's not a national security issue, I say, yes, it is. And this is why it's not just about women, and it's not just about, when we talk gender, it is not just about women. Like, prosperity is for all of us. Peace helps all of us. We fundamentally kind of have to bring it back to that.
Fabulous. Thank you. Almost too many concepts to embrace there, but I think a really interesting take on that link between, I suppose, what we think of as being internal, domestic versus external and statecraft, if you like. Fascinating to also see this idea of leadership is one thing, actually kind of having processes and systems that support the stated objectives is really important as well. So leadership can say one thing, but until you have, say, in the example that you gave, quotas, you don't see that meaningful change or that meaningful engagement. So I might come back to some of that leadership, if I may, and particularly to take advantage of the fact that I have two generals in the room. In fact, three at the very least. Sorry, sir. And really, this is a question for both of you. I'm conscious of the time. There's always more kind of questions than there are time to benefit from everybody's expertise here. But effectively, this idea that leaders do play a really pivotal role in affecting that kind of cultural change. They can lead that from the top. They can lead organisational change. They can drive and sustain that kind of gender equality and women's rights across every aspect of their organisation. I think both of you have sort of suggested that you've got lived experience of exactly this. In much of the world, I think it's fair to say the leadership roles, political, military, diplomatic, are held by males. That's not necessarily a problem. We've actually seen that sometimes these are allies, and we need men to be in this conversation. This is not just something that's kind of women in the room. So how can leaders, including male leaders, really enable that change? What is it that works beyond saying that this is what you want to happen and your vision for the organisation? What are the practical things that we see that really work?
Yeah, if you were to ask me what really works, it is walking the walk. Mm-hmm. It is making deliberate steps, even when there is a choice to take a different route with a very good outcome, but taking a deliberate step to walk in the intended path of creating a team, creating a capacity within your organization that has a diversity of experience, a diversity of background, a diversity of thinking to be able to solve the problems that we see today. And this can happen actually at every single level. When you take a look at from a squad level, who maybe even in a domestic response type of an environment might be going out and trying to help people and be evacuated out of their homes and things like this, what is going to work at any given point in time with the members of that population can change. It might be a woman engaging with the group. It might be a female captain having her master corporal sergeant or her master corporal go talk to that person, because actually the male influence is going to be best to create the effect that we want going forward. It's thinking about how the diversity of the team is going to go forward. And so at that tactical level, when you create the buy-in as to what it happens when you get different members and people who have different backgrounds, it really starts to be something that becomes valued. But you actually have to talk about valuing it. You can't just say, I'd like to have one of those and one of those and one of those and one of those and one of those, and now I have a stir and mix and I'm going to have a fabulous team going forward. You actually have to talk about why it is good and why it is important, and create an environment in which people are going to feel comfortable speaking up. And
you
doing
make
it.
space for it, essentially.
Exactly. And leaders at all sorts of different levels have to make that space. And that means that they've actually got to create the opportunity for that to happen, and to be open enough to not be the person who is got all the answers all of the time.
Military culture, not at all like that.
Not at all like that.
No, but I think a really interesting point, and actually I want to pick up on that point of leadership at every level as well. This is, we tend to think of leadership, particularly in a military context, it is quite hierarchical. That can sometimes be actually a really useful tool or structure for implementing change, but it is needing that leadership at every level. So Tash, we've talked also about this idea of gender responsive leadership. And I suppose what that means for you and what you think works.
Encouraging questions, and I've come from a different forum earlier this afternoon where I was talking with people about it's okay to ask questions. Keep asking questions. Drive people insane with your questions because the questions elicit all sorts of different responses, and it's the question we don't ask that's problematic. And so, and questions elicit lived experience. And so not only do you have people ask questions, I would encourage people to listen. It's that empathy and questions together. So curiosity and questions and empathy on lived experience is really critical. And I guess that's what we're trying to take in. It's okay to ask questions and judge in terms of evidence-based things that are before you. Be transparent and open up around that. And I often talk about, and sometimes it's quite strange, I talk about how I think defence is quite transparent, even though we're considered a closed system. If I look at a Human Rights Commission engagement and partnership that we've had for 10 years, and we've opened ourselves up, like I said it in the framing remarks, applying a human rights approach to ourselves is the first step in being transparent and opening up to learning and engaging. So be transparent. We have women in ADF reports that talk about who's in pipelines, who's doing promotion courses, who's being recognised, is it at the same rate, where do we have to ask more questions to get different capability effects. The lived experience is quite different, and I've been in a hierarchical organisation, the lived experience is, it can be unique across many people, but when you walk in someone's shoes for a period of time and you have that empathetic approach, you start to see, and I often reflect on some of my best training has been restorative engagement, listening, being empathetic and putting yourself in the shoes of the other person to understand and take a different approach. So my husband is a serving member, and we'll often go to different functions and we'll walk in the room and he will be welcomed because they think General Fox is my husband. And so I'll go off and talk to people, and then all of a sudden they'll recognise that he's not General Fox because he plays along with it. And then they'll come back and be incredibly apologetic to me. And so he's experienced not being seen because he has lived it through me. I've had a junior officer walk next to me. He was just a bit taller, and we went to an area where there weren't that many women. So I was the senior person, and a couple of people walked past and saluted. And they saluted him, "Hello, sir." They didn't see me, even though there was two of us and I was on the side that was meant to be taking the salute. And I smiled and said hello. And he said, "Oh, they've obviously just not seen your rank." And then 3 times later, he went, "This is terrible. I'm so sorry. I can't believe this is happening." Then we had a conversation about it. He was then in a lived experience way to understand what a lot of people had experienced. And so the lived experience is critical, but then the restorative approach on that and keep questioning from a leadership perspective is what I think is really powerful.
Fascinating. I don't know if there was anything to add there in terms of nodding along there, Stephanie.
Yeah, there's so many points I could add. Just too quickly, that lived experience, it is so essential. And I was thinking about this. I was in Melbourne recently around the casino. I was going out for a run in the morning, and it was about 6 a.m, just getting light. And I asked one of my male colleagues who lived there, "Is it okay to run in the morning?" He said, "Oh yeah, I run every day, don't worry about it." Lace up my shoes, go out, and these guys were coming out of the pub. They were drunk. They chased me in bed. They harassed me. I felt unsafe. And I thought, your lived experience and your definition of safety, very different to mine. And that's why, again, we need women at the table with the lived experience of safety or
question those assumptions.
It's so essential. And if anyone wants to read a really good book on this, it's Invisible Woman, which looks at how data is really designed for men, not women, and brings that. Anyway, that's the second thing I just want to note on leadership and what to be aware of are social norms and unconscious bias, and that everyone needs to recognize. It's kind of back to that lived experience as well. But if you think about from when we're born and how we raise little boys and how we raise little girls, and we dress little boys in blue and we dress little girls in pink, and so there's been research to show that we are a little bit more robust with little boys. We shake them a bit more. We hold little girls more closely. A little boy's on the playground, he falls up, man up, get up, don't be a sissy. Little girl falls down, don't get your dress dirty, come play nicely. You get into school, you pick up the books, you look at the advertising, the little girls. Even the other day I was looking at BW or something, had little girls doing the cooking and little boys playing with the cars. As we grow up, we are socializing little boys to take risk, and we are socializing little girls to play nicely. We are socializing little boys to take charge, and we are socializing little girls to take care. And when we get into the workforce, we're all geared up to think that way in what women expect of themselves and others, and what men expect of women and themselves. And so if you have Bob and you have Sue, Bob's the leader and Sue's the leader, and you have adjectives next to them. Bob, he takes charge. He closes a deal. He leans in. He can be a bit aggressive. Okay, that's Bob. Sue, she takes care. She's empathetic. She's kind of nice to everyone. She doesn't lose her temper. She's never aggressive. That's Sue. Great. We switch those adjectives. Bob, he takes care. He's a bit emotional. He cries sometimes, right? Sue, she's aggressive. She closes a deal. She leans in. We don't trust Sue and we don't trust Bob, right? And so we have to constantly challenge ourselves and our conscious and conscious bias and other people's lived experience, and putting ourselves in, those shoes with empathy if we're going to have a world that's kind of just and fit for everyone. They're good points.
Thank you. So then, Elise, if I can ask you in terms of some of the thinking that you've done as far as translating some of the research into kind of strategy, into policy, how do we take some of the things that we've talked about here and turn that into a strategy that you can actualize and that you can sustain, I suppose. And also, if you have a bit of time, just to talk through some of the emerging things that we're seeing. So I think Francis earlier talked about this idea that the agenda is not necessarily something we can take for granted. Women for peace and security agenda is essentially under threat in many parts of the world, or at least being challenged, and not least by new technologies or by new means of engagement, modes of engagement. So really interested, I suppose, just in your reflections on some of those kinds of issues, how we sustain this, how we turn this into strategy, but how we see what's coming next, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that these are all really great actionable points. And one thing that I would say is from the research, I already spoke, good policies, that they work. So if you've got something in there, there's a chance that that will work. But we also know that there's a gap between policy and practice often. So what I think about then is, well, what are the KPIs that reward this sort of behaviour? And do your roles have those inbuilt in their KPIs? I also want to think about across international affairs, we currently see not just vertical segregation, where less women are in leadership and more women are down in kind of deputy and lower ranks. We see horizontal segregation. So you're much more likely to see women in human resources, in administrative roles, in deputy roles, in surveillance roles, rather than in operations roles, at the forefront of kind of hard foreign affairs. This means we need to think about where women, peace and security and the really important work of gender equality sits, because it often sits over there on the kind of the soft side of things. It's not really often important. It's not often seen as a core activity. So if we really value women, peace and security, those jobs have to be sought after. They have to be jobs that have prestige and that have ongoing authority that carries with that individual after that particular role. They can't be just a role that we always see women in because women are the only ones who have a gender. That's just not true. So I think we need to be reflective about, actually, is this a good career opportunity for my staff of all genders to go into? And if you can't answer honestly that it is, I think you need to look at your mechanisms, your reward mechanisms and your KPIs and see how you can actually value that. What I will say is that you're also talking about culture shift, and culture shift you can't just do with policy, and it's not easy. And there's some really great examples from previous defence leaders who have come out and who have been really proactive in being against sexism and misogyny. And you know what? They also faced backlash, and they faced a lot of backlash from within their own community, from veteran communities. And, these are otherwise, what we might seem privileged older white men, but they still also feel that backlash, so they are also being policed here. So we do need to acknowledge that it is difficult and put in place the mechanisms that can support us to make the best policy for this, noting that anyone doing this work, it's going to be hard. Thinking about the emerging issues, so I had a few points. So we really need to get to the data on the effectiveness and the blockers for women, peace and security as it currently exists. What we see trends kind of globally from those states who are engaging in women, peace and security, it's not seen as a core activity of our diplomacy or defence. So it is an add-on, nice to have. States like the US do have congressional mandate to report on this, and so they do actually have that real solid, responsibility. However, even so, we often see that they get stuck just thinking about, filling seats, like they're stuck on representation rather than a gender-sensitive policies. We also need to think about whether our policies can evolve sufficiently and be flexible enough to capture things like climate change. My work, I do a lot of work in space as well, cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, other emerging stuff that we don't even know is on the horizon yet. Unfortunately, this is going to mean a prioritisation. So in a lot of women, peace and security, civil society spaces, they are still really, really worried that if we start talking about space, for instance, or cyber, we're going to ignore the fact that there are women on the ground who are facing sexual violence in conflict situations. And by us talking about space or cyber, we're drawing resources away from that really critical prevention work. Therefore, we need to get better at prioritisation and understand that actually if we're to be sufficiently evolving, there needs to be more funds, simply. You cannot expect a women, peace and security agenda that was created before everyone's talking about artificial intelligence or space security threats or, I don't know, something that's happened, just arisen. You can't expect us to deliver on what we've said we will if no further resources are also provided. The final thing I'd say is that we do need to think more seriously about how to handle backlash, regression and co-option. And I think that for all of us who work in this space, I guess you've got to have that horizons planning, outlook approach. I think there's a lot of great military training that can go into being much more strategic about women, peace and security, that can really centre it, and that can be on the outlook for the things that we are, perhaps that are pushing back on us in very subtle ways. Again, funding, status, prestige, this has to be something that's way more important and viewed as way more important because it is. It's fundamentally at the safety and security of our society. So that would be my 2 cents.
Thanks, Can I just jump on that for a little bit? And I think just you're so right on the pieces around data and around funding. Our experience around the ELSI initiative, which you are probably familiar with, which does that first part, which is measuring opportunities and what are those barriers, measuring the opportunities for women in peace operations and what are the barriers that stop people from going forward. So that data work is important first, and we do it for nations. We've done it for ourselves going forward. But then it's actually, so what are you going to do about that then? To take that, and that's then where the work and the investment and the funding has to come to actually say, so how do I change that piece? And it's different for every country, and it's a different scope of what's needed, but it is concentrated effort to try to look and eliminate those things. And sometimes you can pick one thing that's going to be cross-cutting for you, and it's going to knock down a bunch of things across the road, and those are gold stars when you can find those pieces. But it's deliberate effort that has to be put into it, and so it's true on the military side, not just on a foreign affairs side of the house as well, when you consider women in service.
And at least with the data, you have the ability to make that business case, as it were, for prioritisation. I'm again conscious of time, but
I just want to ask a question of the audience quickly.
Let's do this.
No, I'm
here for it.
I live in this backlash issue every single day. And I'm looking at it from that geostrategic level, multilateral level, where we have various states, as we heard, trying to change language. We see it at a non-state actor level, where these non-state actors are funding university programs, think tanks, bot factories, scholarships, etc. We see that then connected to the manosphere and the Andrew Tates of the world, and then we see it through tech-facilitated violence, which is keeping women out of public spaces in a really disproportionate way. And if I asked you, maybe just hands up, are you kind of quite across all of these issues of backlash sitting here in Australia? Because I'm just living and breathing this because I'm traveling all the world. I'm seeing it everywhere. We're reading about it. But is this something that we need to raise more awareness of these issues here in Australia? Or is it something that people are generally, I know Angus will have to raise his hand because I talk about it every day over the dinner table, but
very aware.
Is it something people, just hands up if you're thinking about it? Okay. Like, do we need to do a better job getting some of this out in the Australian space as a absolutely critical threat to not only the human rights of women and girls, to how we're engaging women, peace and security, but to democracy, fundamentally to democracy? Because if we're pushing women out of public spaces, we do not have robust democracy, for example. So it's something that I'm deeply concerned about.
I think, speaking for myself, I would say yes. I think people are broadly aware of the agenda. They're probably the lived experience, of course, makes it a very, very real. That link to democracy, that link to, I suppose, the nation state, and therefore how we might be working with the region, viewing that as a common threat that sits at the state level, I think there's always work to be done on that. That is probably the time to open us up to questions from the floor. I know that we'd be remiss not to take advantage of the panel that we have here today, but thank you so much, all of you, for comments to date. We have a
couple of questions already.
Hi, my name's Susan Hutchinson. I'm doing a PhD on women, peace and security at the Australian National University. I have a two-part question, and it's about funding and reporting on national action plans. So I guess from the Canadian perspective, how are you guys funding, what's the funding setup for the new Canadian National Action Plan, and what's the reporting process? And then from the Australian perspective, what can we expect with regards to the next report for our National Action Plan? And can we expect any funding to support the National Action Plan in our upcoming federal budget? Thank you very much.
I'll just quickly say the next National Action Plan our report will be released very soon, and the budget process is a mystery to me at the moment. So,
As it is to
I'm not the
everybody.
budget person. Yeah, okay.
From a Canadian perspective, I'm afraid you've got the wrong panelist on the National Action Plan, a portion of it. We certainly have a piece of that in defense that we care for. So I couldn't tell you what the overall budget is that's associated to it. I think what's important is what we've tried to do is, and it sounds so geeky, we've built like a logic model that takes us towards what are the things that we need to do to take us towards the focus goals that we have as an organization. And it is then how do we in the 10 organizations and society in general look to advance those things in those areas, sometimes with existing resources that we have. It's ways, it's not just about an application of funding going forward. And that is, I would say, the foundation of our latest National Action Plan is to say we've got a logic model on how we think we need to approach these areas. We need to apply ourselves in those areas, and then we're going to measure ourselves and then course correct as we see successes and as we see perhaps not opportunities that we've achieved that we would have expected going forward. And so that's the approach that we'll think we're taking. And lovely to see you, Susan. We were emailing communications earlier on this week.
There you go. There's a couple of other hands here. Thank you.
Rachel, Department of Defence. I love the fact that you've pointed out meaningful representation. It's not just words, because words matter. It's not just the words we use, but how we use them. And I'm wondering if we framed the problems correctly. There was a book called Lean In. Most of you would probably recognise that title. I took challenge to that because it reinforced that the gender disparity was a woman's issue. We had to lean in more. So I'm just wondering from the panel, does anyone think that we've framed the challenges correctly? And if not, how might we readdress that?
Anyone feel comfortable?
I'll answer it in a roundabout way. So I should have also said in defence, our APS public service representation for women or participation rate is 48%, so getting up there, but 53% in our senior executive service area, which is outstanding. That's taken some time. So we work hand in hand with my public service colleagues in around different policies and approaches. I'm going to answer your question in a different way, and it's to do with International Women's Day. I recently went and talked about International Women's Day, but in the same conversation, I talked about International Men's Day because it wasn't about the day, it was about what we were recognising in the day, and that the International Men's Day this year was about being a positive role model. And so it was about the notion of respect that the days bring, recognising lived experience, recognising more work to do, but there's two sides of a coin here that we take into account in lived experience. To celebrate successes, recognise more work to do, but it's a whole of population effect that we're bringing to capability. So I'm answering it in a different way because you have to understand both sides of a story to get change and make it resonate for change. And that was the piece around Frances was saying, we do, and Stephanie, absolute experience when she was talking about bringing people to the table, understanding everyone's culture and context is different, and you have to understand that to make the meaningful change. You can't go in and impose. Impose never works. How do you bring forward the lived experience and design together to make change? And once you design together, you know you're starting to get a lived experience, a policy that will work and deliver pragmatic outcomes versus words on a page. I look forward to your PhD at some point, because measuring outcomes, measuring what success looks like, we look at it in part in numbers and data, but we also we need to understand, how do you feel in that success? So I have 2 boys, and we have lots of conversations about respect and what does that mean, and having conversations about leadership and it's the best person for the job and the skills that they bring have been fascinating when they revert back to, yes, but that's a better man for the job. I'm like, woo, having a mum response. So it's what does it mean, the 2 sides of the coin, and what is success? For me, it's about that respect in community, that we treat one another with respect to get a better place for us to leave, for people coming behind us. And that will be a safer place. That will be a more inclusive place. That will be a more productive and economically great place for Australians.
I think we do have a couple more questions, but very, very briefly, Stephen, if you just wanted to add on the lean in.
Yeah, very briefly, I would say, I mean, I agree with you. We need to look at gender equality holistically, that gender equality and women, peace and security across the board means every single person should have every single opportunity to meet their full potential, regardless of their gender. And in looking at that, when we shine a light on any one area, we find often, but not always, women and girls may face greater barriers in reaching their full potential than men and boys. Not always. If we shine that light on mental health, for example, and you look at the social norms around mental health, man up, don't cry, then, and you look at some of the suicide rates of men versus women, we need to look at that differently. We need to, though, constantly take a strength-based approach and not a deficit-based approach. So it's not what's wrong with you and how am I going to fix you, but what's right with you and how do I support you? And we need to constantly flip the narrative on its head and say this is a systems issue, not a problem with a woman, right? And I agree with you completely there. We need to redefine it. This is not a woman's problem to fix. This is an issue of systems, of how we define social norms, and we need to tackle that at every level. And again, make it a holistic issue, that this is about everyone. And I think the last thing I would say is that we constantly need to say, this is absolutely the right thing to do, but it is the smart thing to do. And we always need to bring that evidence to the table. You have women at the table, you have much greater chance of peace. You have women at the table, you're not going to address climate change. You can't have green without orange. You ain't going to address it if you don't bring women to the table, given they're not only disproportionately affected, but they disproportionately in a positive way have the solutions with their lived experience. So we constantly need to make sure we're taking that strength-based approach that's informed by evidence that says why this is the smart thing to do. It's a systems problem, not a woman's problem.
That's I guess also the conversation that Canada, Australia, who have been working on these for a while, developing the kind of policy settings for a while, either at institutional, societal, or kind of policy government level. Those are the conversations we're having in the region as well around that idea of actually it is you need to demonstrate why it's important that this agenda is important to you, and that is because it means a safer, more stable, more prosperous country, region, etc. So I think we did have a couple more questions, perhaps one here, and then I think, honestly, I'm getting a lot of glares from the back, which suggests to me that we'll be wrapping up shortly.
Hi everyone, I'm Cameron. I'm a graduate at the Department of Employment and Workplace Relations. Thank you very much for a fascinating and enlightening discussion from the panel. My question is primarily to Ambassador Copus-Campbell, but the floor is open to anyone. I'm just reflecting on the disturbing trend of more young men and boys having increasingly anti-feminist values. And I'm just wondering, from your experience, how do you believe, what's the best way to kind of break the cycle of boys potentially being insecure with their masculinity, believing gender equality is a zero-sum game, and then embracing toxic masculinity.
Thank you for your question. I'm really glad you asked that, and it's something I'm passionate about. And so again, it goes back to my point. We have to start with our whole conversation. I was at something the other day, I won't say where, but there was, it was a big event, and there was a really prominent speaker on the stage, and it was around International Women's Day, and she started making jokes about men. And I said, this isn't helpful. Like, we don't make jokes about women. We don't make jokes about men. We have to start looking at this as, from the very beginning, again, from how we're raising our children to how we're thinking about these issues, we are thinking about it as the evidence, the story that we tell, the way in which we engage, the jokes that we tell, etc. This is about being good for everyone and being able to then demonstrate that and back that up. And again, it's why I like the definition of gender equality as one that looks at barriers for everyone meeting their full potential and removing those barriers. And again, we shine the light on year 12, right? And we have to say in many of our countries what's happening to our young men and why. We need to lift those barriers. So this is not about women and girls. This is not about men and boys. It's about everyone and how we communicate that. And in that sense, language really, really matters, right? For example, we thought long and hard about the word feminism in a feminist foreign policy and decided whilst these feminist principles are incredibly important and our foreign policy, when you see it, will reflect all of those principles in terms of do no harm and looking at the power dynamics and all of that, we're not going to use that word because it can be divisive. It can be looked at in a way that this is women and men, which is not meant to be. But the way in which we engage, the way in which we use language, the way in which we tell the story, the way in which we raise our boys, the way in which we educate our boys and our girls, the way in which we show that they also have opportunities as much as women and they don't feel that they're being left behind, and we pay attention to that. And the way that we can have equality for all is the way that we start to address that. It's essential. And I think the other thing that we have to do in this space is get better and better at how we tackle disinformation, because that is a huge problem. And also, again, the tech-facilitated violence side of it as well. So the whole disinformation coming underneath this is not helpful.
If I can also say, I think that we forget sometimes that young people don't have the full history and lived experience of these issues. So thinking about a lot of young boys and men, who are growing up now, they're growing up in a world where they're seeing a lot of kind of overt stances around women in leadership and gender equality and all of the rest. For a young teenage boy or a young boy, who may be slightly slower to develop than the girls around him anyway, because we do know that boys tend to develop a little bit slower than girls and they catch up eventually and all of the rest. But that can be quite intimidating, right? Like your personal experience might be like, actually, this is really hard and all I see is all of this stuff on gender equality and women and girls and all of the rest. What about me? And you don't necessarily have all of that history that as you get older and you get more educated and all of the rest, you understand. I mean, it was only, my parents' generation that the Commonwealth marriage bar still existed, right? And, when women got married, they had to resign from federal government service. Like this is in a really short period of time. Similarly, it was only in the 80s that in Queensland, you still had to get your husband to sign off on a mortgage. And if you didn't have a husband, well, good luck to you, right? So this is not that far away, but if you're a young person, you might not actually realise that. And if you don't personally experience it, gender inequality might be a completely foreign concept to you. The other thing I'd say from my research was that, I study policies and, organisations and all of their work around gender equality and women's leadership. And one commonality was that often the training is only for managers and leaders, but actually the bulk of your workforce is not managers and leaders, and particularly graduates, they wouldn't get gender responsive training or the rest. Or look in the IT division, they don't get it at all. Our actual trainings upskilling everyone. It has to be whole of organisational. There shouldn't be parts of the organisation that don't have to do it because, oh, they only do the computer stuff over there and they only update our software. That's not the right approach. And same with graduates coming through. They absolutely need to have this training too.
100% agree. It begins, I mean, it's systemic, it's societal. All of that training can't begin early enough. If you're to translate that into leadership at all levels and into strategies, policies, and database. I'm talking to ASPI, we love a bit of evidence-based, data-based research and effective outcomes. I want to thank all of our panellists for sharing some of their lived experience, their views, and I hope that you are all able to join us for some subsequent conversation. Hit them up for any questions that you didn't get a chance to ask for the panel, but we'd love for you to join us outside for a drink and something to eat. Thank you so much, everybody.
Fantastic.